going up. Elevator Systems. Bowen Family Systems Theory in brief for a life of learning.
Welcome to Elevator Systems, the podcast where we take these big ideas from Bowen theory and do our best to present them with our elevator pitch, kind of the clearest, most understandable way we can put these big ideas together. The topic for today's episode is relationship patterns and especially looking at conflict. My name is Dixie Vandersluis. I am a counselor and a member of faculty of Living Systems Counselling in Vancouver. With me is Katie White, who's the executive director at Living Systems and a couple and family therapist. And joining us today is Dr. Kathleen Smith, who is a licensed therapist and writer in Washington, D.C. She's got 2 books, Everything Isn't Terrible and True to You, A Therapist's Guide to Stop Pleasing Others and Start Being Yourself. Kathleen is an associate faculty member at the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family, and she also authors a newsletter called The Anxious Overachiever. So the topic for today is relationship patterns, with specific discussion on conflict. And I think people generally know what conflict is. They've certainly experienced it. And so we're going to focus a little bit more on the idea of relationship patterns. And I guess I wanted to highlight at first that there's a number of terms used in Bowen theory about this idea. So some of the ones that I thought or noticed were nuclear family, emotional process, patterns of emotional functioning, adaptive mechanisms to manage anxiety. I'm wondering if you guys had other, some of those big complicated terms that come to mind that speak of these relationship patterns. Any other ones that come to mind?
Those are the ones I had.
Okay. Yeah, I just had universal predictable patterns for maintaining stability. Come at a cost, I maybe might add. And can I be more specific about conflict? Is that okay? Because I did write something for conflict, my short little pitch. So this is what I came up with. I said, you changing is the key to things getting better, not me. So that's how I sort of think of conflict, as both people seeing the other as the key to unlocking a better relationship. And that standoff between you function up first, and then I will follow. Maybe how much of our thinking is that most of the time.
Right. I think that defines every couples therapy session I've ever participated in.
Exactly. What about you, Katie? What would be your pitch?
I was going to take a stab at just kind of giving some bigger picture to the patterns, because I think it's useful that one of the things that I think is unique maybe to Bowen Family Systems Theory is that there are these patterns. Bowen sat and watched lots and lots of families, and he came up with these 4 patterns that people use when they get under tension or stress. And like you said, he called this the nuclear family emotional process, which I think, say that fast 4 times, it'd be useful to come up with a shorter explanation. But those 4 were distance, over and under functioning, projection on a child or triangles, and conflict. And I think the thing that I wanted to punch up is that these are present in all relationships to one extent or another, right? There are ways that we both helpfully and maybe less helpfully manage tension and stress and anxiety. And I think the key that I think about is that when they get more rigid or more intense is when they tend to become a problem for people. So that was my little, here's what these relationship patterns are. Here's where I see them.
Yeah. Mine was, relationship patterns are the predictable ways people respond in relationship when the intensity picks up. When you sit at the dinner table and someone brings up politics and you can predict exactly how the next 5 minutes will go, the interplay between who gets loud, who gets quiet, who tries to change the subject, who starts pointing fingers, you are observing relationship patterns. That was
And I
my
appreciate
take.
that one you punched up there, Dixie, which is the predictability. I think what I've really appreciated is if you take time to watch a family, or you know, as a therapist, if you sit with people for a long time, you kind of get a sense of there are predictable ways that families respond to this. So just how do you become the detective who can figure out what is your predictable way? What is your system's predictable way? And then what do you do with that?
Yeah. For what I found in Dr. Bowen's writing, this concept describes the patterns of emotional functioning in a family in a single generation. Certain basic patterns between the father, mother, and children are replicas of the past generations and will be repeated in the generations to follow. The most universal mechanism is emotional distance from each other. Other than the emotional distance, there are three major areas: marital conflict, sickness or dysfunction in one spouse, and projection of problems to children. So, yeah, what are common ideas, words you hear in these descriptions of relationship patterns?
I was thinking of conflict. I think, you know, one of the things I think Kathleen might have gotten at it, but you know, it can be used to both manage and create tension. You know, I think that's the interesting thing about these patterns, and conflict in particular is, you know, it's the system trying to right itself in some way, even though it doesn't seem always on the surface that makes a lot of sense.
You know that I think I've gotten, although I still have a long way to go, I've gotten better as a clinician at not getting fixated on busting up a certain process and seeing that as the solution. Really having an appreciation for the stability to some degree. Let's say that conflict or that triangle or distance provides, you know, and because I think then it becomes about somebody trying to force the change, and it's about willpower rather than what Dr. Bowen I think was getting at, which is about thinking differently about the problem and seeing the process, right? And how trying to force a change on a pattern is its own part of the pattern, right? Its own form of overfunctioning, right? And so how do I not just be one more cog, you know, in that process as a clinician, which is so easy to do. I was working with somebody the other day and who had, as a parent, had been trying to overfunction less for their adult child. And, you know, the ability, I was thinking, what's going to happen here? Is the kid going to level up and function better? And the kid went and got a girlfriend to overfunction for him. But this woman was able to laugh about it, right? You know? And so I think the ability to kind of predict that to a certain degree and not see it as surprising really helps people manage themselves differently, calm down a little bit, not see other people as needing to be a certain way for things to get better. And so I just think about just that ability to predict, like you guys were saying, how valuable that is in a family.
And I think I'm going to punch up your thought of the clinician's ability to stay curious and neutral about that, right? I think that's my daily workout as a clinician, to, you know, not overfunction and get in there and try and move things around. But I think what you just said is the ability to just be curious about what's this system going to do? You know, what are the moves that they're going to make? And I think that's very different than, you know, someone maybe working from a different theory might approach a system.
What are examples that you guys thought of? And I guess thinking specifically about conflict.
I was thinking, I had the hardest time thinking of an example. And then the other night, when I was flipping through the channels, Footloose came on. And I hope everyone has seen Footloose, because I just think it's probably a great system example of how so many little levels, both parent and child, husband and wife, how when tension rises in that system, how conflict serves to both connect people and then push them apart to calm the system down for a little while. And then how you watch that both in in the families, each little family and the societal level, right? This community who because of this terrible incident got very, very anxious and tense about their kids, and then responded to that by putting in rigidity, getting conflictual, putting people in the in-group or the out-group. And I just thought that movie was a nice reminder to me about watching this process of conflict and distance and the cycles that occur in it. So if you haven't watched it in a while, now go and watch it and through the lens of Bowen Theory.
I have a series of very, very popular movies from the 80s that I have never watched. And so it's kind of like my badge of honor that I've never seen Footloose or Dirty Dancing or Top Gun. Dare I say all these? I might watch Top Gun. Maybe I'll watch Footloose, all from
Start
the context
with Footloose.
of... Yeah. Kathleen, what are your thoughts?
It's weird. I couldn't think of any pop culture stuff for you guys, which usually is like my go-to, right? But I was thinking about it with conflict, a family that I worked with a while back, and it was sort of I work with a lot of either sort of adults who have kids who aren't speaking to them, sort of, or vice versa, and it's always very interesting. And the sort of the adult children in the family were telling the parents, we need you to, they literally sent a list of demands and were like, we need you to operate in a certain way before we will even entertain like meeting with you. And the definition of we need you to function up, right? Before we will do the same. That description I just gave you a few minutes ago, right? And then the parents were using that as an excuse to not behave. Like, look, this is so unreasonable. Like, what are you doing? And so each side not being able to see, because the kids' chief complaint was that the parents had been over involved and put too much pressure on them, right? And because the conflict was so strong, they could not see how they were putting that back in the other direction, right? The pressure on the other to function a certain way to be able to have a relationship with them. And it's not that people can't have legitimate complaints. Of course they can, but or set boundaries. But I think it's just fascinating to see sort of, for better or worse in this family, this sort of standoff was for the short term, how they kind of chugged along in their lives. And when you're really in it, it is very, very hard to see the process. It becomes all about the content of how people behave and what they're doing, and not how the anxiety gets managed.
Can you think of another? I don't know why I keep doing these pop quizzes, but like something in the natural world in terms of the animal world conflict and its usefulness, and is it like those mating dances or asserting? I don't know. Maybe nothing comes immediately to mind, but.
Well, I think, I can't think of a specific example. And we need the Australians for this because they have all the interesting ecosystems where when you don't have competition over resources and you get these invasive species, what happens when there's not conflict to kind of stabilize things, right? The system kind of goes berserk.
The toads take over and invade.
Yeah, and so I'm thinking about all the pythons in South Florida, right? Which I'm particularly terrified of. So, how maybe competition's a little bit different than conflict, but just thinking about how if the system kind of adjusts and goes along, that kind of creates its own problem, right? Versus there being somewhat of a kind of a standstill.
You need to give me some heads up before these pop quizzes, Dixie, because I'm looking at a picture of a bee sitting off my, and I know that there is a good example of how a hive can suppress reproduction, around conflict, and they can split off and form, a new hive, and that is useful to the system. That conflict is useful and helps each hive sustain and get stronger. But again, I'm going to pull just that's off the top of my mind as to think of that species where that conflict within the group creates, some two new stronger groups.
Okay. Show notes. We'll put it in the show notes.
There you go.
Then you can take all the time you need. My example is I default to conflict avoidance, and I would say my husband does as well. And, I think we can both see where that comes from in our lives. But one of my kids said to us once, as a teenager, I have never seen such unproductive conflict as I have observed in this house. That was her comment about when my husband and I attempt to kind of get at it, and it just doesn't work. And Dr. Daniel Papero, I think it was perhaps on one of the Bowen Center's Family Matters episodes, said, people mistake the absence of conflict for the absence of a problem. And I thought that just resonates with me, because in my mind, as long as we're not fighting, it's good. Like, as if not fighting was the goal versus solving the problem. Figuring out how we're going to manage this challenge is clearly the thing that we need to chase after, but often I chase after, let's not argue about this.
Right. Well, to me, this is an interesting question, though, because is productive conflict, or is it differentiation of self? Like,
that is a great question.
Is conflict always that stalemate kind of?
Yeah, because if we're talking about disagreement, that, to me, that is different than the emotional process of like binding up anxiety through focus on the other. That's how I think of conflict,
And I was thinking about it, I wrote down in my notes that one of the things that I think when I sit with people and I'm watching my own family, how conflict does bring people in touch with one another. In a sense, you're pretty, when I think about, I'm pretty focused on someone. I'm pretty interested in someone when I am in an intense conflict with them. And if there's been, my family has a tendency to be more distant. So when we have a conflict that brings us together, something heated we're debating between, I think it's a different usefulness to my system and bringing us together. So I think, one of the ways I was thinking about that is conflict is useful in that way, that it can bring people in contact with each other.
I mean, I live like a couple blocks from the Hill, so I think you literally just described Congress. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily use the word productive, but they're close together.
Right. Yes, there you go. There you go.
Well, Kathleen, maybe you want to say a little bit more of this distinction between, disagreement versus this mechanism, this pattern in families of conflict.
I think the level of anxiety can't be the measure, right? Because often, defining oneself to others increases the anxiety, right? And so,
right.
I think often I'm very quick to misinterpret something as conflict because I've made a move, and I might guess that the other person is upset with me or disagrees with me, but I'm not really operating in reality, right? So I think it's easy to assume there's conflict when maybe there isn't. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have a clear answer to that question, but I just think like, because when people say like, oh, conflict is good for a marriage, but what they're talking about is two people who have different opinions about things and like to debate, which I feel like is different than people making a project out of each other, as Jenny Brown likes to say. To me, that's different.
Right.
You're and kind of like in the arena, like, what is Brene Brown? She says in the arena, right? Like you're in the arena in one, and I don't think you are in the other, because there's not a lot of self in making people into projects.
Maybe you just define for yourself the difference there, Kathleen.
Okay, well, there you go. Problem solved.
Well, and then go back to your first pitch about conflict. Can you say it once more, Kathleen, about...
you changing is the key to things getting better. And then Bowen talked about this, when both people think it's conflict. When one person thinks it and the other goes along with it, it's over and under functioning. And when, let's say, two parents or caregivers are addressing it to the child, then you've got the triangle or the family projection process. So it kind of just depends on what the response is and what direction the anxiety is kind of going in.
That was a great summary.
Thank you. That's not that. I think that maybe that's from family evaluation. So I think it's Dr. Kerr maybe who describes it that way. I don't want to give credit where credit is due. That was really helpful for me to read that the first time, to see that sort of the relationship between the different patterns.
Yeah. Well,
so the work on differentiation, right? When conflict is focused on the other versus disagreement is me holding on to my own thinking while being in conversation with another person. And maybe we don't think the same, but we can be in conversation.
And I think if they're trying to change you, but you're just saying you're thinking, that's not conflict. Yeah. That's, I was listening the other day to, sorry if I'm going too far here, but I was listening to the other day that actually Dr. Papero did. It was an oral interview with the Archives Project about his sort of first encounter with Dr. Bowen. And what really stood out to him when he first heard him speak was that people love to try and kind of shoot down his ideas, but he wasn't trying to convince them. He said, he wasn't trying to throw bricks back, right? He was just saying, well, I think the science is this, or here's what I think about it, right? And so it's fascinating when a person is able to kind of engage without that brick throwing, right? And in a way that it takes both to make the conflict, right? Because without both people trying to convince or change the other, then you've got just one person who's able to kind of be a self and manage themselves in the face of that pressure, which I think we so rarely see these days. But when you do, it's just a fascinating thing.
Hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. A phrase that stuck with me over the years is don't withdraw, don't attack, don't defend, define. Instead, that stuck with me.
Gotta put that one on a mug, Dixie.
Right. That could be our Elevator Systems t-shirt.
Can you add don't text to that? I feel like you've got to get the modern edition. That's the triangle piece, but
yeah.
There you go.
And then I'm trying, what would be my automatic immature would be don't make eye contact, get really bitter. I don't know. I'd have a whole list of things that I do that are just the opposite of that.
Write a dissertation about why they're a meanie. That's what in your head. That's what I do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think we're talking about this already, but what is useful about this idea of, knowing, observing these relationship patterns and conflict in particular?
Well, I think the most obvious answer to me is that you see the opportunities for changing your part and for kind of playing around with it. You start to get interested and take that kind of researcher attitude to it. It's kind of fun to some degree to kind of throw a wrench into things. It may not feel fun in the moment, but it's if you're interested enough to see what will happen, I think that can be very motivating. And I think it keeps you less. It keeps my tentacles kind of away from others when I'm able to see the process.
I was thinking, Kathleen, that building on that idea, I really appreciated your Thanksgiving bingo idea to really, have this place where people come together as a family and that you can just be interested in observing what are the patterns that people do? What might I try differently next year? I mean, to pick an event like that occurs every year and just be interested in these patterns, it gives, it's a bit of a superpower. I think at some level, it gives you a choice in the matter if you have a sense or just an interest. If I sit next to Aunt Sue versus Aunt Jenny, what shifts?
Yeah, that was actually my takeaway, was that I think it's actually a subscribed writing, that Thanksgiving anxiety bingo, but that was my takeaway. And my automatic is, let's play cynical family bingo, when here they all go doing all these irritating things, right? And I appreciated it was observing yourself and what you're doing in the middle of it. Yeah. I think the usefulness for me is it gives me, when I know these patterns and I can see where it's going to go, I have some space to think, is this really what I want to do? Like I had an interaction with my son when he was about 16, 17, and we both knew the response I was about to make, and I knew where the next 5 minutes would devolve. And instead I used humor, and it just like dissipated the moment, and we like sort of sorted it out and stayed connected. And it was because I could, I knew our humanity and I decided to be a little bit different. So yeah.
Dixie, I was thinking one of my takeaways was going to be in Dr. Kerr's newest book, Bowen Theory Secrets. I really appreciate at the end of the chapter, I think on nuclear family emotional process, he says, Bowen identified these patterns. I've thought about these patterns, and he asked the questions, can it really be this simple? I know it's not simple, but to break these down into these categories, is that really it? And I appreciated that challenge. It just allows me to think like a researcher in the system. Like, do I see something else? So far, my own observations are these do a good job of breaking down what I observe in families, but I appreciate the challenge. And I know some people who might be listening to this will be longtime students of Bowen Theory and thinking about, would they see something different? Do they want to take on Dr. Kerr's challenge of, is it this simple that there's these ways that systems predictably respond to tension and stress and anxiety? So that was my takeaway challenge for people.
Yeah, and certainly our next episodes will be about distance triangles, over and under functioning. So we're going to cover the 4, and yeah, there are others. Yeah, Kathleen, did you have a takeaway or an idea or a resource or a question?
I mean, my takeaway is always being patient while people get curious, because I am terrible at that. This is already something I'm very curious about. So it can be, and I'm also not related to any of the people a person I'm working with is talking about. So I have this freedom to be curious about the family's challenges in a way that a person who's in the family does not, right? So how do you be patient with somebody, and instead of forcing a person to change a pattern, to just be able to go, well, they're just not interested yet. How am I getting in the way of that curiosity developing? How do I ask good questions or use maybe examples in nature or other, how do you relate to somebody as they shift to using the front part of their brain? Because I just think it's so easy to, like I said earlier, just get caught up in the patterns yourself and in the process of trying to see the other person as the key to things getting better, right? And how do I do that as a therapist or as a coach almost every day to some degree, right? So how do I see myself as a piece of being a resource to people who are trying to think about how they want to operate differently, right? And so it's just so easy to shift into that. And so to me, that's that constant challenge of just being patient with people and myself as we learn to kind of be systems thinkers day to day.
I love that, Kathleen. And I think about, being open enough to hearing it. I always said one of the greatest gifts my sister, who I can peg as the meanie in the family, said to me one night after a couple glasses of wine, Katie, you are mean to people too. And it was like this, just huge thing that I'm only looking at it from my perspective. And so to hear it from her perspective was just so useful to me. But it took, a conversation, years for me to think about that and be ready to hear I had a part in this too. So I really appreciate that, Kathleen.
Yeah. Somewhere in the middle of my living systems training was the question of what are people up against when they engage with you? Which is not a question we think about very often.
I love that. I'm so convicted right now. I'm going to be chewing on that one.
Well, I think the show notes will put up that link to that Let's Play Family Anxiety Bingo. And Kathleen, I don't know if you would want to say anything about if your new book covers these patterns or conflict or...
Yes, it does. I would be in a lot of trouble, speaking of togetherness earlier, if it did not. So, yeah, I mean, that's the, how do you, before you can be yourself, you have to figure out what you already do and what you expect day to day. And that's where you'll see those patterns. So, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us today. I've appreciated your questions over the years of like laying out, this is the automatic response, and when I think a little differently or ask myself other questions, how it can be different. So it's been really great to have you here, and I want to thank those of you who have tuned in for your interest in systems thinking, and I hope that this will have stirred some of your own thoughts as you go out into your relationships.
This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen Family Systems Theory across Canada.